The rifle barrel gleamed cold in the moonlight as Victoria Lewis pressed her back against the rough cabin wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the broken window, she could hear Kenneth Allen's steady voice cutting through the night air like a blade. "You want her? You go through me first." The words hung in the darkness, heavy with promise and threat, while three men with torches stood silhouetted against the tree line, their intentions as clear as the hatred burning in their eyes. But how had she come to this moment, standing in a stranger's cabin with a man she barely knew, willing to risk his life for her? The answer lay buried in the desperate weeks that had led her up this unforgiving mountain, carrying nothing but grief and the terrible weight of having nowhere else to turn. The morning Victoria Lewis first heard about the job, frost still clung to the windows of Millfield's only boarding house, and her last dollar lay flat against the bottom of her worn leather purse. She sat at the scarred wooden table in the common room, staring at the dregs of coffee she couldn't afford to replace, while the other residents whispered behind cupped hands about the strange woman who'd been living on charity for 3 weeks now. Mrs. Henderson, the boarding house keeper, approached with the careful steps of someone delivering bad news. "Victoria, dear, I'm afraid I'll need the room by week's end." The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples of panic through Victoria's chest. She nodded, unable to trust her voice, and watched the older woman's face soften with something that might have been pity. It was then that old Martha Bailey, hunched over her morning porridge at the next table, spoke up with the crackling voice of someone who'd seen too many winters. "There's work up on Copper Ridge," she said, not looking up from her bowl. "Mountain man named Kenneth Allen put word out last month. Needs someone to keep house, cook, tend to things. Nobody's taken it yet." Victoria's pulse quickened despite herself. "Why hasn't anyone taken it?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Martha's spoon clinked against the ceramic bowl. "Because Kenneth Allen's got a reputation. Lives alone up there like some kind of hermit. Folks say he's dangerous, unpredictable. Lost his whole family in a fire years back, and something in him just broke." She finally looked up, her roomy eyes meeting Victoria's. "Course, dangerous men sometimes just need someone who understands what it means to lose everything." The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. Her own loss was still so fresh, so raw, that sometimes she forgot to breathe around the edges of it. 3 months since the fever took her husband Douglas, 2 months since the bank claimed their little house, 6 weeks since she'd discovered there was no money left, no family to turn to, no place in the world that wanted a 32-year-old widow with no particular skills and no connections. "How much does it pay?" she asked, hating the desperation she could hear creeping into her own voice. Martha shrugged. "Enough to live on, I'd reckon. He's not poor, that one. Just particular about his privacy. The job posting's still up at Henderson's store, if you're fool enough to consider it." Victoria spent the rest of that gray morning walking the muddy streets of Millfield, weighing her options and finding them wanting. She could try to find work in the textile mill, but they'd made it clear they weren't hiring women without references. She could attempt to secure a position as a governess or companion, but those jobs required connections she didn't possess and a wardrobe she couldn't afford. She could throw herself on the mercy of the church, but the thought of becoming a permanent object of charity made her stomach turn. By afternoon, she found herself standing outside Henderson's general store, staring at a hand-lettered notice tacked to the bulletin board between advertisements for patent medicines and livestock sales. The paper was weathered, its edges curled from weeks of mountain wind and rain. "Housekeeper wanted. Room and board provided plus wages. Must be reliable, discreet, and capable of managing household independently. Remote location. Serious inquiries only. Apply in person to Kenneth Allen, Copper Ridge Trail. Follow markers to cabin." Victoria read it 3 times, each pass making her more aware of what the notice didn't say. It didn't mention hours or specific duties. It didn't provide references or character testimonials. It didn't even hint at why a man would need to advertise for help in a town where work was scarce and workers were plentiful. She was still staring at the notice when Henderson himself emerged from the store. A stout man with kind eyes and the permanent stoop of someone who'd spent decades bending over a counter. "You thinking about that job, Mrs. Lewis?" he asked, following her gaze to the posting. "I'm considering it," she admitted. Henderson was quiet for a long moment, weighing his words carefully. Kenneth Allen's not a bad man, he said finally. Troubled, maybe. Angry at the world, certainly, but not bad. He comes to town maybe once a month for supplies, pays his bills, doesn't cause trouble, just keeps to himself up there on the mountain. But, Victoria prompted, sensing there was more. But he's been alone too long, Henderson continued. Some men, when they lose what matters most to them, they just shut down, build walls so high nobody can climb over them. Might be that's what you'd be walking into. Victoria nodded, understanding more than Henderson probably realized. She'd felt those same walls rising around her own heart, brick by brick, since Douglas died. The difference was that she couldn't afford the luxury of shutting down completely. Not yet. Thank you for the honesty, she said. Henderson studied her face with the careful attention of a man who'd spent years reading customers. You're thinking about taking it, aren't you? It wasn't a question, and Victoria didn't try to deny it. I don't have many options left. Well, Henderson said, reaching into his vest pocket and pulling out a small piece of paper. If you do decide to go up there, you give him this note from me. Tell him I sent you. Might help smooth the way a little. Victoria took the note, feeling its weight like a promise or a threat. What does it say? Just that you're a decent woman who's had some hard luck, and that you're not the type to cause trouble or spread gossip. Sometimes that's all a man like Kenneth Allen needs to hear. That evening, Victoria sat in her small boarding house room, staring out at the darkening sky and trying to imagine what her life might look like if she climbed that mountain trail tomorrow. She thought about Douglas, about the quiet contentment they'd shared in their little house with its garden and its dreams of children who would never come. She thought about the future she'd planned, the security she'd believed in, the naive certainty that love would be enough to protect them from the world's cruelties. All of that was gone now, swept away like leaves in a storm. What remained was this, a choice between the known misery of charity and dependence, or the unknown risks of a job that nobody else wanted with a man that nobody else trusted. She made her decision sometime in the dark hours before dawn, when the boarding house was quiet except for the settling of old wood and the distant sound of someone coughing in their sleep. She would take the job, not because she was brave, but because she was desperate, not because she trusted Kenneth Allen, but because she had no other choice worth making. The trail to Copper Ridge began behind the Methodist church, where a weathered wooden sign pointed toward the mountains with the simple word Allen carved into its face. Victoria started climbing at first light, carrying everything she owned in a battered canvas satchel that had belonged to her grandmother. The weight of it cut into her shoulder as the path grew steeper, winding through stands of pine and aspen that seemed to close in around her with each step. The morning air was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of snow from the peaks above and the earthy smell of pine needles underfoot. Victoria had to stop frequently to catch her breath, unused to the altitude and the demands of the climb. Each rest gave her time to question her decision, to imagine turning back and facing Henderson's disappointed but unsurprised expression when she returned to town empty-handed. But she kept walking, driven by the simple truth that there was nothing behind her worth returning to. The trail markers Henderson had mentioned appeared at irregular intervals, small metal plates nailed to tree trunks with arrows pointing ever upward. Someone had maintained this path recently. The fallen logs had been cleared away, and the worst of the rocky sections had been reinforced with carefully placed stones. After 2 hours of steady climbing, Victoria crested a ridge and saw the cabin for the first time. It sat in a natural clearing, perhaps 100 yards ahead, surrounded by towering pines that seemed to stand guard around its perimeter. The structure was larger than she'd expected, built from massive logs that spoke of both permanence and isolation. Smoke rose from the stone chimney, and she could see a well-tended garden plot to one side, though it was dormant now in the late autumn chill. What struck her most was how deliberately remote it was. This wasn't a cabin built by someone who occasionally wanted to get away from civilization. This was a fortress constructed by someone who never wanted to see another human being again. Victoria stood at the edge of the clearing for several minutes, gathering her courage and trying to imagine the man who lived in such splendid isolation. Henderson's words echoed in her mind, troubled, angry, alone too long. She thought of her own anger, the rage that sometimes woke her in the middle of the night with its intensity, and wondered if Kenneth Allen's fury was anything like her own. A movement at one of the cabin's windows caught her attention, and she realized she was being watched. The knowledge sent a flutter of nervousness through her chest, but she forced herself to walk forward, her boots crunching on the frost-covered grass. She was still 20 feet from the front door when it opened, and Kenneth Allen stepped onto the covered porch. Victoria's first impression was of size and stillness, of a man who took up space without apology and moved with the careful economy of someone accustomed to being alone. He was taller than she'd expected, with broad shoulders and the kind of lean strength that came from physical labor rather than leisure. His dark hair was longer than fashion dictated, and his beard was neatly trimmed but substantial. But it was his eyes that stopped her short, pale blue, and watchful, holding the kind of wariness she recognized from her own mirror. "You're here about the job," he said. It wasn't a question, and his voice carried the slight roughness of someone who didn't use it often. "Yes," Victoria replied, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "Mrs. Victoria Lewis. Henderson in town said you might be willing to see me." Kenneth's gaze flicked to the note she held out, and he descended the porch steps to take it from her. His fingers were long and calloused, she noticed, the hands of someone who built things and fixed things and made his own way in the world. He read Henderson's brief message without expression, then looked back at her with those unsettling pale eyes. "You know what kind of work this is?" he asked. "Housekeeping," Victoria said. "Cooking, cleaning, general maintenance, managing a household." Kenneth nodded slowly. "And you know where this is? How far from town? How isolated?" "I walked up here," Victoria replied. "I understand the location." He was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made her want to fidget. She forced herself to stand still and meet his gaze, though something in his expression made her feel exposed, as if he could see straight through to all her fears and failures. "Why do you want this job?" he asked finally. "Because I need the work," Victoria answered honestly, "and because sometimes the best place to heal is somewhere nobody can find you." The words surprised her as much as they seemed to surprise him. She hadn't planned to say anything so revealing, but something about his directness had drawn the truth out of her. Kenneth's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, and for just a moment, the wariness in his eyes was replaced by something that might have been understanding. "Come inside," he said, turning back toward the cabin. "We'll talk about terms." The interior of the cabin was as surprising as its size had been. Victoria had expected rough bachelor quarters, but what she found was a space that was both functional and comfortable. The main room was dominated by a massive stone fireplace with built-in shelves lined with books and comfortable furniture arranged to take advantage of the warmth. The kitchen was well-equipped and spotlessly clean, and she could see doorways leading to what appeared to be several other rooms. Everything spoke of a man who had built this place to last, who had thought carefully about how he wanted to live, and had created exactly what he needed. There was nothing careless or temporary about any of it. Kenneth gestured toward a chair near the fireplace, and Victoria settled into it gratefully, realizing how tired the climb had made her. He remained standing, one arm resting on the mantelpiece, maintaining the careful distance she was beginning to recognize as habitual. "The job is straightforward," he said without preamble. "Keep the house clean, prepare meals, maintain the garden in season, preserve food for winter. I'm not particular about schedules or methods, just results. The pay is $15 a month plus room and board." Victoria tried to keep the relief from showing on her face. $15 was more than she dared hope for, enough to begin rebuilding some small measure of security. "I have my own quarters," Kenneth continued, gesturing toward a doorway on the far side of the room. "You'd have the back bedroom and use of the main house during the day. I keep irregular hours and I value quiet. I don't entertain visitors and I don't encourage conversation beyond what's necessary for the work." The terms were blunt but not unreasonable. Victoria had expected as much from a man who chose to live in such isolation. "I can agree to those conditions," she said. Kenneth studied her for another long moment. "Henderson says you're widowed." "Yes," Victoria replied, feeling the familiar tightness in her chest that always accompanied any mention of her loss. How long? 3 months, she said quietly. Kenneth nodded, and something in his expression softened almost imperceptibly. Then you understand why a man might want to be left alone. Yes, Victoria said. I do. He moved away from the fireplace, walking to one of the windows that looked out over the clearing. The afternoon light caught the silver threads in his dark hair and highlighted the strong line of his profile. Victoria found herself studying him with the same intensity he'd shown her, trying to read the story written in the set of his shoulders and the careful way he held himself apart from the world. There's one more thing, Kenneth said without turning around. People in town, they'll tell you stories about me, about what happened to my family, about why I live up here alone. I'm not interested in discussing any of that. The past stays in the past. I understand, Victoria said, and she meant it. She had her own stories that she didn't want to share, her own past that felt too raw to examine. Kenneth turned back to face her. When can you start? Now if you like, Victoria replied. I don't have anywhere else to be. For the first time since she'd arrived, Kenneth's expression approached something that might have been a smile. It transformed his face completely, softening the harsh lines and revealing a glimpse of the man he might have been before whatever tragedy had driven him to this mountain. Then welcome to Copper Ridge, Mrs. Lewis, he said. Let me show you to your room. Victoria's first week at the cabin passed in a blur of learning routines and establishing boundaries. Kenneth had not exaggerated about his preference for solitude. He disappeared each morning after a breakfast eaten in comfortable silence, returning at irregular intervals throughout the day to work on various projects around the property. She learned to recognize the sound of his axe splitting wood, the rhythmic hammering that meant he was repairing something, the quieter sounds of him tending to the animals he kept in a small barn behind the cabin. He was, she discovered, almost entirely self-sufficient. The garden plot she'd noticed on her first day was part of an elaborate system that included root cellars, smokehouses, and storage areas stocked with enough supplies to last through the harshest winter. The man who lived like a hermit had created a world that needed nothing from the outside except the most basic necessities. Victoria found herself settling into the rhythm of it more easily than she'd expected. There was something deeply satisfying about the simple, essential nature of the work. She swept floors that stayed clean, prepared meals that were eaten with appreciation, if not conversation, tended to a household that functioned with the precision of a well-made clock. After months of feeling useless and displaced, it was a relief to be needed again, even if that need was expressed through Kenneth's careful nods of approval rather than words. Her room was small but comfortable, with a window that looked out toward the valley below and the distant lights of Millfield. At night, she would sit by that window and think about the strange turn her life had taken. A month ago, she had been a charity case with no prospects and no hope. Now she was earning her own way in a place that felt more like home than anywhere she'd been since Douglas died. The work itself was not difficult, but it required attention to detail that she found oddly comforting. Kenneth's standards were high but not unreasonable, and she began to take pride in meeting them. She learned that he preferred his coffee strong and black, that he ate breakfast before dawn and dinner after sunset, that he read voraciously and took care of his books with the reverence some people reserve for religious artifacts. She also learned to read his moods, the subtle signs that indicated whether he wanted to be left entirely alone or whether he was open to brief practical conversations about household matters. He was never unkind, but his emotional weather changed like the mountain climate, shifting from distant courtesy to something approaching warmth and back again without warning. It was during her second week that Victoria first glimpsed the depth of Kenneth's isolation and began to understand what had driven him to create this fortress of solitude. She was cleaning the main room when she noticed a photograph on one of the bookshelves, partially hidden behind a volume of poetry. Without thinking, she moved the book aside to dust the shelf properly and found herself looking at a family portrait. The man in the photograph was recognizably Kenneth, but younger and softer somehow, his arm around a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Two children sat in front of them, a boy of perhaps 10 and a girl who couldn't have been more than 6. All 4 faces glowed with the unmistakable warmth of people who belonged together, who had built something precious and intended to keep it forever. Victoria was still staring at the photograph when she heard Kenneth's boots on the porch. She quickly replaced the book and moved away from the shelf, but not quickly enough to escape his notice. He paused in the doorway, his gaze moving from her to the bookshelf and back again, and she saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I was just dusting." Kenneth walked to the shelf and carefully repositioned the book so that the photograph was hidden again. His movements were deliberate and controlled, but Victoria could see the tension in his shoulders. "That was my family," he said without looking at her. "They died 4 years ago. House fire while I was away on business." The words were delivered in the same matter-of-fact tone he used to discuss practical matters, but Victoria could hear the carefully suppressed emotion underneath. She thought of her own loss, of the way grief could ambush you at unexpected moments, and felt a sudden kinship with this guarded man. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, meaning it completely. Kenneth finally looked at her, and for a moment, his careful composure slipped enough for her to see the raw pain that lived behind his pale eyes. "It's why I came up here," he said. "Why I built this place. Some losses are too big to carry around other people." Victoria nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. After Douglas died, she had felt like a walking wound, as if her grief was visible to everyone she encountered. The well-meaning sympathy of friends and neighbors had felt like salt in an open cut, making everything worse instead of better. "Yes," she said simply. "They are." Kenneth studied her face for a long moment, and she had the sense that he was seeing her clearly for the first time, recognizing something in her that matched his own experience. "What did you lose, Mrs. Lewis?" he asked quietly. "My husband," Victoria replied. "Fever took him last spring. We'd been married 8 years. Kenneth nodded slowly. "Children." "We wanted them," Victoria said, feeling the familiar ache that accompanied any mention of the family she and Douglas had planned, but never had. "It just never happened for us." "Sometimes that's a mercy," Kenneth said, and there was such profound sadness in his voice that Victoria felt her throat tighten in response. They stood in silence for several minutes, two people who had lost everything that mattered and found themselves thrown together by circumstance and necessity. Victoria felt something shift between them, a recognition that went deeper than employer and employee, deeper than the careful boundaries they had established. "The work continues," Kenneth said finally, but his voice was gentler than she'd heard it before. "Yes," Victoria agreed, "it does." That evening, Kenneth broke his usual pattern of disappearing into his private quarters after dinner. Instead, he settled into his chair by the fireplace with a book while Victoria finished cleaning the kitchen. She was acutely aware of his presence, of the way the flickering firelight played across his profile and the quiet sound of pages turning. When she finished her work, she hesitated at the edge of the main room, uncertain whether his continued presence was an invitation or simply a coincidence. "You can sit if you like," Kenneth said without looking up from his book. "The fire's warm enough for both of us." Victoria settled into the chair across from him, grateful for the warmth and the unexpected companionship. She had brought her own book, a novel she'd been reading in small increments when time allowed, but she found herself watching Kenneth instead. There was something peaceful about his presence, something that reminded her of evenings with Douglas, when they had sat together in comfortable silence, each absorbed in their own pursuits but connected by proximity and choice. "What are you reading?" she asked after a while, surprising herself with the question. Kenneth held up the book so she could see the spine. "Thoreau," he said. "Walden." Seemed appropriate for the circumstances. Victoria smiled despite herself. A man who lives alone in the wilderness, reading about a man who lived alone in the wilderness. Kenneth looked up from the page and she saw something that might have been amusement in his eyes. "Exactly," he said, though Thoreau only managed 2 years. "I'm working on 4. "And how is it?" Victoria asked. "The solitude, I mean." Kenneth considered the question seriously. "Peaceful," he said finally, "but lonely, more lonely than I expected it to be." The admission surprised her with its honesty, and she felt another small barrier fall between them. "Is that why you decided to hire someone?" "Partly," Kenneth said. "Also because I'm a better carpenter than I am a cook, and I was getting tired of burning my own meals." Victoria laughed, a sound that seemed to surprise both of them. It had been months since she'd found anything genuinely amusing, and the release felt almost foreign. "Well," Kenneth said, closing his book and looking at her directly, "I think we understand each other, Mrs. Lewis." "I think we do," Victoria agreed. "Good," Kenneth said, rising from his chair. "Then perhaps this arrangement will work out after all." As autumn deepened into the first hints of winter, Victoria began to understand the true scope of Kenneth's self-imposed exile and the careful systems he had built to sustain it. The man who appeared to be a simple hermit was actually running a complex operation designed to minimize any dependence on the outside world. He hunted for meat, preserved vegetables from his garden, maintained his own equipment, and even distilled his own whiskey in a small still hidden in the woods behind the cabin. Victoria found herself becoming an integral part of these systems, learning skills she had never imagined needing. Kenneth taught her to smoke meat, to can vegetables, to recognize the signs that indicated when firewood was properly seasoned. He showed her how to maintain the various mechanical devices that kept the cabin functioning, from the hand pump that brought water from the well to the complex system of pulleys and counterweights that operated the root cellar. There was something deeply satisfying about mastering these practical skills, about becoming competent in ways that had nothing to do with social graces or feminine accomplishments. Victoria discovered that she had an aptitude for the kind of problem-solving that mountain living required. And Kenneth's occasional nods of approval meant more to her than any compliment she had ever received in her previous life. Their conversations, while still infrequent, began to range beyond the purely practical. Kenneth had strong opinions about books and politics, about the changes he saw happening in the world below, about the value of self-reliance versus the comfort of community. Victoria found herself looking forward to these discussions, to the way his mind worked through complex ideas with the same methodical approach he brought to everything else. She also began to notice things about him that had nothing to do with his hermit reputation, the way he always saved the choicest portions of meat for her plate, the care with which he had arranged her room, ensuring that it caught the morning light and had the best view of the valley, the small acts of consideration that he performed without acknowledgement or expectation of gratitude. One evening in late October, as the first snow began to dust the peaks above them, Victoria was preparing dinner when she heard an unfamiliar sound from outside. Kenneth had been working on the roof all day, reinforcing it for the winter weather, and she assumed the noise was related to his project. But when the sound came again, she realized it was something else entirely. Someone was shouting Kenneth's name from the direction of the trail. Victoria moved to the window and saw three men emerging from the tree line, their horses steaming in the cold air. Even from a distance, she could see that they were armed and that their posture suggested trouble rather than a friendly visit. Kenneth appeared on the roof, his hammer still in his hand, and called down to them. "What do you want, Gary?" The lead rider, a heavy-set man with a red face and aggressive bearing, dismounted and walked closer to the cabin. "We want to talk, Kenneth, about the woman you've got living up here." Victoria felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. She had been dreading this moment, knowing that her presence at the cabin would eventually become a source of gossip and speculation in town. "There's nothing to discuss," Kenneth replied, his voice carrying clearly in the thin air. "Mrs. Lewis is my housekeeper. It's a business arrangement." Gary Baker laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "That's not what folks are saying in town, Kenneth. They're saying you've got yourself a woman up here, living in sin, corrupting the moral fabric of the community." Kenneth climbed down from the roof with deliberate slowness, never taking his eyes off the three men. His movements had the fluid grace of someone prepared for trouble, and Victoria noticed that he positioned himself between the visitors and the cabin's front door. "What folks say is none of my concern," Kenneth said. "And it's none of yours either, Gary. You and your friends need to leave my property." The second rider, a thin man with nervous eyes, spoke up. "We're not here to cause trouble, Kenneth. We're here as representatives of concerned citizens. There are standards to maintain, even out here in the wilderness." Victoria recognized the rhetoric of moral outrage, the same judgmental language that had followed her through her final weeks in town. She had hoped that distance and isolation would protect her from such scrutiny, but apparently her past had followed her up the mountain. Kenneth's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, and Victoria realized he was preparing for the confrontation to escalate. The men facing him were armed and outnumbered him, but something in his stillness suggested that he was not intimidated by the odds. "I'll ask you one more time to leave," Kenneth said quietly. Gary Baker's face reddened further. "You can't hide behind your reputation forever, Alan. People know what you are, what you've done, and now they know what kind of woman you're keeping up here." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Victoria saw Kenneth's hands clench at his sides. Whatever reputation Gary was referring to, it clearly carried weight, and the threat was unmistakable. "Get off my land," Kenneth said, and his voice carried an edge that made Victoria's breath catch. The three men exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. The third man, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. "This isn't over, Kenneth. The community has a right to protect its moral standards." They mounted their horses and rode away, but their departure felt more like a strategic retreat than a genuine ending. Victoria remained at the window, watching until they disappeared into the trees, her heart racing with a combination of fear and anger. When Kenneth came inside, his face was grim, and his jaw was set in hard lines. Victoria had seen him angry before, but this was different. This was the controlled fury of a man who had been pushed too far. "I'm sorry," Victoria said quietly. "I never meant to bring trouble to your door." Kenneth looked at her sharply. "This isn't your fault, Mrs. Lewis. Gary Baker and his friends have been looking for an excuse to cause problems for me since I came up here. You just gave them a convenient target. But they're right about one thing," Victoria said, feeling the weight of social judgment settling around her shoulders like a familiar cloak. "People will talk. They'll assume the worst." "Let them talk," Kenneth replied with fierce conviction. "Their opinions don't change the truth, and they don't determine how we live our lives." Victoria wanted to believe him, but she had already paid the price for defying social expectations. The loss of respectability was a luxury she wasn't sure she could afford again. "They might come back," she said. Kenneth nodded grimly. "They might. Gary Baker's not the type to let something like this go." "Maybe I should leave," Victoria said, though the words felt like broken glass in her throat. "Find another position somewhere else." Kenneth turned to face her fully, and the intensity in his pale eyes stopped her breath. "You're not going anywhere, Mrs. Lewis. This is your home now, and I'll be damned if I let a bunch of small-minded bullies drive you away from it." The fierceness of his declaration surprised them both. Victoria felt something warm and unfamiliar unfurling in her chest, a feeling she had thought died with Douglas. Not love exactly, but something deeper than gratitude and more complex than simple affection. "Thank you," she said quietly. Kenneth's expression softened slightly. "We take care of our own up here, Mrs. Lewis. That's how it works." That night, Victoria lay awake listening to the wind in the pines and thinking about the confrontation with Gary Baker and his companions. She understood now that her presence at the cabin represented more than just a job opportunity. It was a statement, a challenge to the social order that governed life in places like Millfield. A widow living alone with an unmarried man, regardless of the practical arrangements, would always be seen as scandalous by people who measured morality in terms of appearances rather than intentions. But for the first time since Douglas died, she felt like she had someone willing to stand beside her against the world's judgment. Kenneth's fierce protection had awakened something in her that she had thought was gone forever, a sense of belonging that went deeper than mere employment. She thought about the photograph hidden behind the poetry book, about the family Kenneth had lost and the pain that had driven him to this mountain. She thought about her own losses, her own reasons for accepting a job that nobody else wanted. Two broken people, she realized, trying to build something new from the pieces of their shattered lives. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and reminding her that winter was coming. Soon the trail to town would be impassable, and she and Kenneth would be truly alone together, cut off from the world and its judgments. The thought should have frightened her, but instead, it filled her with something that might have been anticipation. The first major snowfall came 3 days later, transforming the mountain landscape into a world of pristine white silence. Victoria woke to find the windows frosted over and the familiar sounds of the forest muffled by the heavy blanket of snow. When she looked outside, she could barely make out the trail that connected them to the world below. Kenneth was already up, stoking the fire, and preparing coffee with the methodical efficiency she had come to associate with him. He looked up when she entered the main room, and she saw satisfaction in his expression. "We're officially cut off," he said, gesturing toward the windows. "Trail won't be passable again until spring thaw." The words should have been alarming, but Victoria felt only a sense of relief. Whatever came next, Gary Baker and his moral crusaders would have to wait until the snow melted to continue their campaign of intimidation. "How do you feel about being trapped up here with a hermit for the next 6 months?" Kenneth asked, and there was something almost playful in his tone. "I think I can manage," Victoria replied, surprised by her own lightness. "As long as the hermit doesn't mind being trapped with a scandalous widow." Kenneth's smile was quick and genuine. "I think I can manage that too." The rhythm of their days changed with the snow. Kenneth's outdoor projects were curtailed by the weather, which meant he spent more time inside, more time in Victoria's company. She discovered that he was an excellent chess player, a skilled carpenter who could create beautiful objects from scraps of wood, and a surprisingly good storyteller when the mood struck him. Victoria found herself looking forward to the evenings by the fire, to the conversations that ranged from philosophy to practical matters to shared memories of their former lives. Kenneth spoke rarely of his lost family, but when he did, his voice carried a tenderness that made her understand how deeply he had loved them. In return, she told him about Douglas, about their quiet happiness and their unfulfilled dreams, about the way grief had hollowed her out and left her feeling like a stranger to herself. These conversations created an intimacy that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with recognition. They were two people who had been broken by loss and were slowly, carefully learning to trust again. One evening in December, as they sat reading by the fire, Victoria became aware that Kenneth was watching her instead of focusing on his book. When she looked up, he didn't look away. "What is it?" she asked. "I was thinking about what you said that first day," Kenneth replied, "about the best place to heal being somewhere nobody can find you." Victoria set down her book, giving him her full attention. "What about it?" "I think you were right," Kenneth said, "but I also think I was wrong about something." "What were you wrong about?" Kenneth was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "I thought healing meant forgetting, putting the past behind me so completely that it couldn't hurt anymore. But watching you these past months, seeing how you carry your grief without letting it destroy you, I think maybe healing is something different." Victoria felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "What do you think it is?" "I think it's learning to carry the weight without letting it crush you," Kenneth said. "Learning to honor what you've lost without sacrificing what you might still find." The words hit Victoria with surprising force, and she realized that Kenneth had articulated something she had been feeling but couldn't express. Her love for Douglas would always be part of her, but it didn't have to be the only part. She could grieve what she had lost while still being open to what might come next. "You're a wise man, Kenneth Allen," she said softly. Kenneth's smile was self-deprecating. "Took me long enough to figure it out." They returned to their books, but the atmosphere between them had shifted in some subtle way. Victoria felt as if they had crossed an invisible threshold, moving from careful friendship towards something deeper and more complex. The next morning brought news that shattered their peaceful isolation. Victoria was preparing breakfast when she heard the distant sound of voices carrying across the snow-covered clearing. Kenneth appeared from his room, fully dressed and alert, his expression grim. "Someone's coming up the trail," he said. "On snowshoes." Victoria moved to the window and saw 3 figures making their way slowly through the deep snow, their progress marked by the dark line of their track against the white landscape. Even at a distance, she could see that they were armed. "It's Gary Baker," Kenneth said, joining her at the window, "and his friends." "But how?" Victoria asked. "I thought the trail was impassable." "Not if you're determined enough," Kenneth replied, "and stupid enough to risk your life to make a point." Victoria felt the familiar chill of fear settling in her stomach. Gary Baker's willingness to brave a dangerous winter journey to reach them spoke to an obsession that went beyond simple moral outrage. "What do they want?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Kenneth's jaw tightened. "They want to finish what they started. Make an example of us." Victoria watched the three figures drawing closer and felt a surge of anger that surprised her with its intensity. She had spent months running from judgment and condemnation, accepting that her choices had made her a target for other people's righteousness. But something had changed during her time on the mountain. She had found her strength again, her sense of self-worth, and she was not willing to surrender it to men like Gary Baker. "What are we going to do?" she asked. Kenneth looked at her, and she saw something fierce and protective in his pale eyes. "We're going to make it clear that they're not welcome here," he said, "and if they won't listen to reason, we'll make them listen to something else." He moved to a cabinet that Victoria had never seen him open and withdrew a rifle, checking its action with practiced efficiency. The sight of the weapon should have frightened her, but instead, it filled her with a grim satisfaction. Kenneth Allen might be a hermit, but he was not a victim. "Stay inside," Kenneth said, moving toward the door. "Let me handle this." "No," Victoria said firmly. "They came here because of me. I'm not hiding while you face them alone." Kenneth paused, his hand on the door handle. "Mrs. Lewis." "Victoria," she corrected. "If we're going to face this together, you should use my name." Kenneth's expression softened slightly. "Victoria, then. But you stay behind me, and you do exactly what I say." "Agreed," Victoria said. Kenneth opened the door and stepped onto the porch, the rifle held ready but not overtly threatening. Victoria followed, positioning herself slightly behind him, but still visible to the approaching men. Gary Baker and his companions were closer now, perhaps 50 yards away, and Victoria could see the determination in their faces. They had not come this far through dangerous conditions to be turned away by words. "That's far enough, Gary," Kenneth called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. Gary Baker stopped, but did not retreat. "We need to talk, Kenneth, about the situation you've created up here." "There's no situation," Kenneth replied. "Just a man and his housekeeper living quietly and bothering nobody." The second man, whom Victoria now recognized as Wayne Smith from the general store, stepped forward. "Come on, Kenneth. We all know what's really going on here. A man and woman living alone together, unmarried, setting a bad example for the whole community." "What we do on my property is none of your business," Kenneth said, and Victoria heard the warning edge creeping into his voice. "It becomes our business when it affects the moral standards of decent people," Gary Baker shouted back. "We've got wives and daughters to think about, Kenneth. We can't have them thinking this kind of behavior is acceptable." Victoria felt a surge of rage at the implication that her very existence was somehow corrupting to other women. She stepped forward, ignoring Kenneth's restraining gesture. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Baker?" she called out, her voice sharp with anger. "That I disappear for the convenience of your moral sensibilities?" Gary Baker's face flushed red with anger or embarrassment. "We're proposing that you conduct yourselves in a manner befitting decent Christian people," he replied. "Get married or separate. Those are your choices." "And if we refuse?" Victoria asked, though she already knew the answer. "Then we'll make sure the whole territory knows what kind of people you are," the third man said. "Make sure you can't find work or shelter anywhere decent folks live." The threat hung in the air between them, as clear as the winter sky. Victoria understood now that this was not really about morality or community standards. This was about power, about the right of some people to dictate how others live their lives. Kenneth raised the rifle slightly, not quite pointing it at the three men, but making its presence unmistakable. "You've said your piece, Gary. Now get off my land before I decide you're trespassing." Gary Baker's eyes narrowed. "You threatening us, Kenneth?" "I'm informing you," Kenneth replied calmly. "This is my property, and you're not welcome here. Leave now, or I'll remove you myself." The three men exchanged glances, and Victoria could see them weighing their options. They were armed, but Kenneth had the advantage of position and familiarity with the terrain. More importantly, he had the calm confidence of a man who was prepared to back up his words with action. "This isn't over," Gary Baker said finally. "We'll be back in the spring, and we'll bring the sheriff with us." "You do that," Kenneth replied. "I'm sure Sheriff Morrison will be very interested to hear about three men threatening a woman on private property." Gary Baker's face went even redder, but he gestured to his companions, and they began to retreat. Victoria watched them go, feeling a mixture of relief and apprehension. The immediate confrontation was over, but the underlying threat remained. When the three men had disappeared back into the trees, Kenneth lowered the rifle and turned to Victoria. "You all right?" he asked. "I'm fine," Victoria replied, though she could feel her hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline. "Thank you for standing up to them." Kenneth's expression was serious. "They'll be back, Victoria. Probably with more men, maybe with legal authority behind them. We need to be prepared for that." Victoria nodded, understanding the implications. "What do you suggest?" Kenneth was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the snow-covered landscape. "There is one option," he said finally. "One way to make their moral objections irrelevant." Victoria felt her heart skip a beat. What option? Kenneth turned to face her, and she saw something vulnerable and uncertain in his expression. "We could get married," he said quietly. "Make it legal and proper and give them nothing to complain about." The words hung between them like a bridge that could either connect them or collapse under the weight of their implications. Victoria stared at Kenneth, trying to process what he had just suggested and what it might mean for both of them. "Marriage," she said finally, testing the word. Kenneth's expression was carefully neutral, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "It would solve the immediate problem," he said. "Give us legal protection against people like Gary Baker." "Is that the only reason?" Victoria asked quietly. Kenneth looked away, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "No," he said after a long moment. "It's not." Victoria felt something flutter in her chest, a sensation she hadn't experienced since the early days of her courtship with Douglas. But this was different, more complex, built on shared understanding rather than youthful passion. "What are the other reasons?" she asked. Kenneth was quiet for so long that Victoria began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I've come to care about you, Victoria. More than I expected. More than I thought I was capable of after losing Sarah and the children. Because when I think about you leaving, about facing the rest of my life alone again, it feels like another kind of death." The honesty of his words took Victoria's breath away. She had seen glimpses of the man behind Kenneth's carefully constructed walls, but this was the first time he had let her see him completely unguarded. "And because," Kenneth continued, turning back to face her, "I think you might have come to care about me too. At least a little." Victoria felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "More than a little," she admitted. Kenneth's expression softened with something that might have been relief. "Then you'll consider it." Victoria thought about the life she had built on this mountain, about the peace she had found in Kenneth's careful companionship, about the way he had stood between her and the world's judgment without asking for anything in return. She thought about Douglas, about the love they had shared and the way it had ended, and realized that her feelings for Kenneth were not a betrayal of that memory, but a testament to her capacity to heal and grow. "Yes," she said, "I'll consider it." Kenneth nodded, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "There's no rush," he said. "Think about it as long as you need to." But even as he said the words, they both knew that time was not unlimited. Spring would come eventually, and with it, Gary Baker's promised return. Whatever decision they made would need to be made soon. That evening, they sat by the fire as usual, but the atmosphere between them had changed again. The possibility of marriage hung in the air, unspoken but present, coloring every glance in casual interaction. Victoria found herself studying Kenneth with new eyes, trying to imagine what it would mean to bind her life to his, to commit to sharing this mountain sanctuary, not just as employee and employer, but as husband and wife. The practical considerations were straightforward enough. They already lived together comfortably, already shared the daily rhythms of domestic life. Kenneth was kind and thoughtful, intelligent and capable. He had shown himself willing to protect her, to stand against the world's judgment for her sake. In many ways, he would make an ideal husband. But Victoria had been married before, had experienced the deep intimacy that came with true partnership, and she wondered if what she felt for Kenneth could grow into something that profound. She cared about him, certainly. She respected him, enjoyed his company, felt safe in his presence. But was that enough foundation for a marriage? Kenneth seemed to sense her internal struggle. "You don't have to decide tonight," he said quietly, not looking up from his book. I know, Victoria replied, but I keep thinking about it anyway. What are you thinking? Victoria set down her own book, considering how to articulate the complexity of her feelings. I'm thinking about the difference between a marriage of convenience and a marriage of choice, she said finally. Kenneth looked up at her, his pale eyes serious. What do you mean? I mean that we could marry to solve a practical problem, to protect ourselves from people like Gary Baker, Victoria explained. And that might be enough for some people. But I've been married before, Kenneth. I know what it feels like to be truly partnered with someone, to have that kind of deep connection, and I'm not sure I could be satisfied with less. Kenneth nodded slowly. I understand, he said, and I want you to know that I would never pressure you into something that felt like settling. Victoria felt a surge of affection for him, for his consideration and his willingness to put her comfort above his own desires. But I also want you to know, she continued, that what I feel for you isn't just gratitude or convenience. It's something real, something that could grow into more given time and opportunity. Kenneth's expression brightened slightly. So you're not saying no? I'm not saying no, Victoria confirmed. I'm saying that if we do this, I want it to be because we both believe it could become something meaningful, not just because it's the practical solution to a problem. Kenneth closed his book and leaned forward in his chair. Victoria, he said, his voice intense with sincerity, I lost the love of my life 4 years ago. I thought that part of me was dead, that I would never feel anything like that again. But these months with you have shown me that the heart can heal, that it's possible to find connection again, even after devastating loss. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I'm not saying I love you the way I love Sarah, he continued. That was a different kind of love, built over years of shared experience. But I am saying that I care about you deeply, that I admire your strength and your kindness, that I've come to depend on your presence in ways I didn't expect. And I believe that with time, what we have could grow into something as meaningful as what I lost. Victoria felt her throat tighten with emotion. Kenneth's honesty was both heartbreaking and hopeful, acknowledging the reality of their situation while still holding space for the possibility of something deeper. I feel the same way, she said quietly, about Douglas, about you, about the possibility of finding love again. Kenneth reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, his fingers warm and calloused against her palm. Then we're agreed, he said. If we do this, we do it with the intention of building something real. Victoria squeezed his hand, feeling the rightness of the decision settling into her bones. Yes, she said, we're agreed. Kenneth smiled, and the expression transformed his entire face. So, Victoria Lewis, will you marry me? Victoria looked at this man who had given her shelter when she had nowhere else to go, who had stood against the world's judgment for her sake, who had shown her that it was possible to heal without forgetting, to love again without betraying the past. Yes, Kenneth Allen, she said, I will marry you. Kenneth's smile widened, and he lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. The gesture was old-fashioned and courtly, but it sent warmth spreading through Victoria's chest like sunlight breaking through clouds. When? He asked. Victoria thought about Gary Baker's threats, about the sheriff he promised to bring in the spring, about the need to establish their union as legal and legitimate before their enemies could use it against them. Soon, she said, before the snow melts, before they can come back with reinforcements. Kenneth nodded. I'll send word to town as soon as the weather breaks enough for travel. We can have the ceremony here, just the minister and whatever witnesses we need. Victoria felt a flutter of nervousness at the thought of actually going through with it, of speaking vows that would bind her to this man and this mountain permanently. But underneath the nervousness was a deeper sense of rightness, a feeling that she was choosing her own path rather than having one forced upon her. Are you sure about this? Kenneth asked, as if sensing her internal struggle. Victoria looked around the cabin that had become her home, at the man who had become her anchor, at the life they had built together through shared work and gradual trust. She thought about the alternatives, about returning to the world of charity and judgment, about facing the future alone and unprotected. I'm sure, she said, and meant it completely. That night, Victoria lay in her bed listening to the wind in the pines and thinking about the steps she had agreed to take. In a few weeks, she would be Kenneth's wife, legally and permanently bound to him and to this mountain sanctuary. The thought should have terrified her, but instead it filled her with a quiet sense of anticipation. She had lost everything once before, had been stripped of security and identity, and forced to rebuild from nothing. But this time she was not rebuilding alone. This time, she had a partner who understood loss and healing, who valued her strength as much as her vulnerability, who was willing to stand with her against whatever challenges the world might bring. It was not the life she had planned, not the future she had imagined when she was young and certain that love would be enough to protect her from hardship. But it was a good life, built on solid foundations of mutual respect and shared purpose. And perhaps, with time and care, it could become something even more precious than what she had lost. The opportunity to send word to town came sooner than expected. A week after Kenneth's proposal, they woke to find the weather had turned mild, the heavy snow giving way to a brief thaw that made the trail temporarily passable. Kenneth prepared to make the journey himself, but Victoria insisted on accompanying him, knowing that her presence would lend weight to their request and help dispel any rumors about her circumstances. The descent to Millfield was treacherous, the trail slick with melting snow and hidden ice, but Kenneth's steady presence and sure footing gave Victoria confidence. They moved carefully, taking frequent rests, and reached the town just as the afternoon sun was beginning to sink behind the western peaks. Millfield looked smaller than Victoria remembered, its buildings huddled together against the winter cold like animals seeking warmth. The few people they encountered on the main street stared openly at Victoria, their expressions ranging from curiosity to disapproval. Word of her living arrangement with Kenneth had clearly spread, just as they had expected it would. Their first stop was the parsonage, where Reverend Edward Kim greeted them with the careful courtesy of a man walking on uncertain ground. Victoria had met the minister briefly during her first weeks in town, and she remembered him as a thoughtful man who tried to balance Christian charity with social expectations. "Mr. Allen, Mrs. Lewis," he said, gesturing them into his modest sitting room, "what brings you to town on such a difficult day?" Kenneth got straight to the point. "We want to be married, Reverend, as soon as possible." Reverend Kim's eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression remained neutral. "I see," he said, "and you're both certain about this decision." "We are," Victoria said firmly, meeting the minister's gaze directly. Reverend Kim studied them both for a long moment, and Victoria had the sense that he was trying to read the true nature of their relationship, to determine whether this was a genuine union or simply a response to social pressure. "There are certain requirements," he said finally. "Bans must be published, witnesses must be present, the ceremony must be conducted in accordance with both civil and religious law." "We understand," Kenneth said. "We're prepared to meet whatever requirements are necessary." Reverend Kim nodded slowly. "Very well. I can publish the bans this Sunday, and if there are no objections, we can conduct the ceremony the following week. Will you be having the service here in town or up at your cabin?" "At the cabin," Victoria said quickly. "We prefer privacy." Reverend Kim's expression suggested that he understood the reasons behind that preference. "I'll need at least 2 witnesses," he said. "Perhaps you could ask Henderson and his wife to accompany me up the mountain." Kenneth agreed, and they spent the next few minutes working out the practical details. Reverend Kim would bring the necessary paperwork, Henderson would serve as one witness, and Mrs. Henderson would stand as the other. The ceremony would be simple but legally binding, conducted in the main room of Kenneth's cabin. As they prepared to leave, Reverend Kim placed a gentle hand on Victoria's arm. "Mrs. Lewis," he said quietly, "I want you to know that whatever gossip you may have heard, I believe every person deserves the chance to find happiness and security. I hope you and Mr. Allen will find both in your marriage." The kindness in his voice brought tears to Victoria's eyes. "Thank you, Reverend," she said. "That means more than you know." Their next stop was Henderson's store, where they found the proprietor checking inventory behind his counter. Henderson looked up as they entered, his expression brightening with genuine pleasure. "Mrs. Lewis, Mr. Allen," he said warmly. "Good to see you both. How are you managing up there in all this snow?" "We're managing well," Kenneth replied. "Actually, we have some news to share." Henderson set down his ledger, giving them his full attention. "We're getting married," Victoria said, feeling a flutter of nervousness at speaking the words aloud. Henderson's face broke into a broad smile. "Well, that's wonderful news," he said. "Congratulations to you both." The genuine warmth of his response was a relief after the stares and whispers they had encountered on the street. Victoria felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. "We were hoping you and Mrs. Henderson might serve as witnesses," Kenneth said. "The ceremony will be at the cabin next week." Henderson nodded enthusiastically. "We'd be honored," he said. "Martha will be delighted to hear the news. She's been hoping things would work out for you two." They spent a few more minutes discussing the arrangements, and Henderson promised to spread the word among the more sympathetic members of the community. As they prepared to leave, he pulled Kenneth aside for a quiet word. "You watch yourselves," he said in a low voice. "Gary Baker's been stirring up trouble about you two, talking about moral corruption and setting bad examples. He's got some folks worked up about it." Kenneth's expression hardened. "What kind of trouble?" "The kind that might not wait for spring," Henderson replied grimly. "Baker's been talking about taking action, about not letting this kind of behavior stand in a decent community." Victoria felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "Are you saying they might come back to the cabin?" Henderson looked troubled. "I'm saying Gary Baker's not the kind of man to let something like this go, especially not when he thinks he has righteousness on his side. You two need to be careful." "We will be," Kenneth said, but Victoria could hear the edge of anger in his voice. They left the store with their business completed, but their peace of mind shattered. The knowledge that Gary Baker was actively working against them, possibly planning some kind of intervention, cast a shadow over what should have been a joyful occasion. The journey back up the mountain was made in relative silence, both of them lost in their own thoughts about the challenges that lay ahead. The trail was even more treacherous in the gathering darkness, and they had to move slowly and carefully to avoid a potentially fatal misstep. It was full dark by the time they reached the cabin, and Victoria had never been so grateful to see the warm glow of firelight through familiar windows. Kenneth built up the fire while she prepared a simple meal, both of them settling into the comfortable routines that had become second nature over the months they had lived together. But the easy companionship of the evening was underscored by a new tension, an awareness that their peaceful isolation was about to be permanently altered. In a week, they would be husband and wife, legally bound together in the eyes of both God and man. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. As they sat by the fire after dinner, Victoria found herself studying Kenneth's profile in the flickering light. Soon this man would be her husband, and she would be his wife. They would share not just a household but a life, with all the intimacies and responsibilities that marriage entailed. "Are you having second thoughts?" Kenneth asked, as if he could read her internal struggle. "No," Victoria said, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. "Not second thoughts. Just thinking about how much is going to change." Kenneth nodded thoughtfully. "Some things will change," he said. "But the important things, the things that brought us to this point, those will stay the same." "What do you mean?" Kenneth turned to face her fully. "I mean that we'll still be two people who understand loss and healing, who respect each other's strength and independence, who've chosen to face the world together rather than alone. Marriage doesn't change those fundamental truths about who we are." Victoria felt some of her anxiety ease at his words. "You're right," she said. "Those are the things that matter." Kenneth reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers in a gesture that was becoming familiar. "Whatever challenges come," he said, "we'll face them as partners. That's what marriage means to me." Victoria squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses on his palm and the steady warmth of his skin. "To me too," she said. That night, as she lay in her bed for what would be one of the last times as a single woman, Victoria thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a desperate widow with no prospects and no hope. Now she was about to marry a good man who cared for her, who respected her, who was willing to build a new life with her based on mutual understanding and shared purpose. It was not the fairy tale romance of her youth, but it was something perhaps more valuable. A partnership built on solid ground, tested by adversity, and chosen with full knowledge of its challenges and possibilities. In a week, she would be Mrs. Kenneth Allen, and this mountain cabin would be her permanent home. The thought filled her with a quiet satisfaction that was deeper and more lasting than any passion she had ever known. The week leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of preparation and nervous anticipation. Victoria found herself cleaning the cabin with obsessive thoroughness, as if the success of the ceremony depended on the perfect arrangement of furniture and the absolute absence of dust. Kenneth, meanwhile, threw himself into practical projects, reinforcing the porch steps and repairing a loose shutter that had been rattling in the wind for months. They were both, Victoria realized, channeling their anxiety into productive activity, using work as a way to manage the magnitude of what they were about to undertake. The easy companionship they had developed over the months remained, but it was now colored by an awareness of impending change that made every interaction feel slightly charged with significance. 3 days before the ceremony, Kenneth surprised Victoria by presenting her with a wooden box he had crafted during his evening hours by the fire. The box was made from cherry wood, with delicate hinges and a lid that fit perfectly, and when Victoria opened it, she found a simple gold band nestled inside. "It was my grandmother's," Kenneth explained, his voice unusually hesitant. "She gave it to my mother, and my mother gave it to Sarah. I thought, if you're comfortable with it, you might wear it." Victoria lifted the ring from its nest of soft cloth, feeling the weight of its history and the trust Kenneth was showing by offering it to her. The band was worn smooth by years of wear, but the gold still gleamed warmly in the firelight. "Are you sure?" she asked quietly. "This belonged to the women in your family." Kenneth's expression was serious but certain. "You're going to be family, Victoria, and I think they would have liked you." The simple statement brought tears to Victoria's eyes. She slipped the ring onto her finger, finding that it fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. "It's beautiful," she said. "I'll treasure it." Kenneth's smile was soft and genuine. "It looks right on your hand," he said. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and cold, with the kind of brilliant blue sky that made the snow-covered peaks look like something from a fairy tale. Victoria woke early, her stomach fluttering with a mixture of excitement and nerves that reminded her of her wedding day with Douglas, though the circumstances could hardly have been more different. She had chosen to wear her best dress, a deep blue wool that brought out the color of her eyes and had the advantage of being both practical and reasonably elegant. Kenneth had offered to buy her something new for the occasion, but Victoria preferred the symbolism of wearing something she already owned, something that represented her choice to enter this marriage as herself, rather than as someone transformed by the ceremony. Kenneth, she noticed, had taken equal care with his appearance. He wore a white shirt that she had never seen before, pressed trousers, and a jacket that showed off his broad shoulders and lean build. His hair was neatly combed, his beard freshly trimmed, and when he looked at her across the breakfast table, his pale eyes held a warmth that made her breath catch. "You look beautiful," he said simply. "So do you," Victoria replied, and meant it. Reverend Kim and the Hendersons arrived just after noon, their horses steaming in the cold air and their faces red from the challenging ride up the mountain trail. Victoria watched from the window as Kenneth went out to greet them, taking charge of their horses and helping Mrs. Henderson down from her side saddle with careful courtesy. Mrs. Henderson, a plump woman with kind eyes and a practical manner, embraced Victoria warmly when she entered the cabin. "My dear," she said, "you look lovely. I'm so happy for you both." The genuine affection in her voice helped settle some of Victoria's nerves. She had been worried about how the ceremony would feel, whether the presence of relative strangers would make it seem forced or artificial, but Mrs. Henderson's motherly warmth made the cabin feel less isolated and more connected to the broader community of decent people who wished them well. Reverend Kim had brought all the necessary paperwork, and he spent a few minutes reviewing the legal requirements with Kenneth and Victoria in explaining their rights and responsibilities as married couple. The formalities were straightforward but somehow reassuring, grounding the ceremony in practical reality rather than pure emotion. "Are you both ready?" Reverend Kim asked when the preliminaries were complete. Victoria looked at Kenneth, seeing her own mixture of nervousness and determination reflected in his expression. They had talked through this decision carefully, had weighed the practical and emotional considerations, had committed to building something meaningful together. There was no reason to delay. "We're ready," Kenneth said, speaking for both of them. They gathered in front of the fireplace, with Reverend Kim facing them and the Hendersons standing to one side as witnesses. The afternoon light streaming through the windows caught the dust motes dancing in the air and gave the familiar room a sense of ceremony and importance. Reverend Kim opened his prayer book and began to speak, his voice carrying the weight of tradition and authority. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Kenneth Allen and Victoria Lewis in holy matrimony. Victoria felt Kenneth's hand find hers, his fingers intertwining with her own, in the gesture that had become their symbol of partnership and mutual support. The words of the ceremony washed over her, familiar phrases about love and commitment and the sacred nature of marriage. But what struck her most was the steadiness of Kenneth's presence beside her. When Reverend Kim asked if Kenneth would take Victoria as his wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health for better or worse, Kenneth's response was clear and unwavering. "I will," he said, his eyes never leaving Victoria's face, and when the same question was posed to Victoria, she felt the rightness of her decision settle into her bones like a physical certainty. "I will," she said, her voice strong, despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. The exchange of rings was simple but profound. Kenneth slipped a plain gold band onto Victoria's finger, beside his grandmother's ring, while she placed a matching band on his hand. The rings had been purchased in town during their visit, simple symbols of their commitment that would mark them as married to anyone who cared to look. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado," Reverend Kim intoned, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Kenneth, you may kiss your bride." Kenneth's hands came up to frame Victoria's face, his touch gentle and reverent. When his lips met hers, the kiss was soft and sweet, a promise rather than a passion, and Victoria felt something settle into place inside her chest, a sense of rightness and belonging that she had not felt since Douglas died. The Hendersons applauded, and Mrs. Henderson wiped tears from her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Reverend Kim smiled broadly as he closed his prayer book, and the cabin filled with the warm buzz of congratulations and well wishes. Victoria found herself swept into Mrs. Henderson's embrace, then Henderson's hearty handshake, then Reverend Kim's formal but sincere congratulations. Through it all, she was acutely aware of Kenneth's presence beside her, of the gold band on her finger, of the fact that she was now Mrs. Kenneth Allen, permanently and legally bound to this man in this mountain. The celebration that followed was modest but heartfelt. Victoria had prepared a wedding cake of sorts, a simple pound cake decorated with preserved berries, and Kenneth had opened a bottle of whiskey that he had been saving for a special occasion. They ate and drank and talked by the fire, the conversation ranging from practical matters to shared memories to hopes for the future. As the afternoon wore on, Reverend Kim and the Hendersons began to make preparations for their return journey, wanting to reach town before full darkness made the trail too dangerous to navigate. Victoria felt a flutter of nervousness at the thought of being alone with Kenneth as his wife, but it was overwhelmed by a deeper sense of anticipation. "Thank you," she said to each of their guests as they prepared to leave, "for everything." "It was our pleasure," Mrs. Henderson said, emphasizing Victoria's new title with obvious satisfaction. "You take care of each other now." "We will," Kenneth promised, his arm coming around Victoria's waist in a gesture of protection and possession that sent warmth spreading through her chest. They stood on the porch together, watching their guests disappear down the trail until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance and they were alone again. But the solitude felt different now, charged with new possibilities and responsibilities. "Well, Mrs. Allen," Kenneth said, turning to face her with a smile that was both tender and slightly uncertain. "How does it feel to be married?" "Different," Victoria admitted, "but good different." Kenneth's smile widened. "I'm glad," he said, "because I have to admit, I was a little nervous about how this would change things between us." Victoria reached up to touch his face, feeling the roughness of his beard under her palm. "Some things will change," she said, echoing his words from the week before. "But the important things will stay the same." Kenneth covered her hand with his own, pressing it more firmly against his cheek. "I love you, Victoria," he said quietly. "I know it's soon, and I know this isn't exactly a conventional romance, but I want you to know that what I feel for you is real." The words sent a shock of joy through Victoria's system. She had hoped that Kenneth's feelings for her went beyond practical affection, but hearing him say it aloud made it real in a way that all their previous conversations had not. "I love you too," she said, and realized as she spoke the words that they were completely true. Not the desperate passion she had felt for Douglas in their youth, but something deeper and more mature, built on understanding and respect, in the kind of trust that could only come from weathering difficulties together. Kenneth's kiss was different this time, deeper and more urgent, carrying the promise of intimacy and the weight of commitment freely given. When they broke apart, both of them were breathing hard, and Victoria could see her own desire reflected in Kenneth's pale eyes. "Are you ready for this?" he asked softly, and she knew he was talking about more than just the physical aspect of marriage. Victoria thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment, about the woman she had been 6 months ago and the woman she was now. She thought about the life she was choosing, the man she was choosing to share it with, the future they would build together on this mountain that had become her sanctuary. "Yes," she said, her voice steady with certainty. "I'm ready." Their wedding night was gentle and tentative, a careful exploration of new intimacy between two people who had learned to trust each other slowly and completely. Kenneth was patient and considerate, taking his time to ensure Victoria's comfort, and she found herself responding to his touch with a warmth that surprised her with its intensity. They came together not with desperate passion, but with the deeper satisfaction of two people who had chosen each other with full knowledge and complete commitment. Afterward, as they lay together in Kenneth's bed that was now their bed, Victoria felt a profound sense of rightness about the choice they had made. Kenneth's arm was around her, her head resting on his shoulder, and she could hear the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her ear. "No regrets?" Kenneth asked softly, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "None," Victoria replied, and meant it completely. The days that followed their wedding settled into a new rhythm that was both familiar and transformed. They still shared the daily work of maintaining the household and preparing for winter, but now their partnership had a deeper dimension, an intimacy that colored every interaction. Kenneth was more openly affectionate, quicker to touch her hand or kiss her forehead, and Victoria found herself responding with a warmth that had been dormant since Douglas died. But their peaceful honeymoon period was shattered one morning in early February when Victoria looked out the window and saw smoke rising from the direction of the trail. Not the thin, gray smoke of a campfire, but the thick, black smoke that spoke of something larger and more destructive, burning out of control. "Kenneth," she called, her voice tight with alarm. He appeared immediately, following her gaze to the ominous column of smoke. His expression darkened as he studied the location and intensity of the fire. "That's coming from the old trapper's cabin," he said grimly, "about halfway down the trail." "But there's no one living there," Victoria said. "It's been abandoned for years." Kenneth's jaw tightened. "Someone set that fire, Victoria, and I think I know who." Even as he spoke, they could hear the sound of horses approaching through the forest, moving fast and making no attempt at stealth. Kenneth moved quickly to the gun cabinet, withdrawing the rifle and checking its action with practiced efficiency. "Stay inside," he told Victoria, away from the windows. But Victoria had no intention of hiding while danger approached their home. She moved to the window, staying back from the glass, but positioned so she could see what was happening in the clearing. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, and Victoria's heart sank as she recognized Gary Baker in the lead. The other 2 men were strangers to her, but their bearing and equipment suggested they were not ordinary townspeople. They looked like the kind of men who made their living through violence and intimidation. Kenneth stepped onto the porch, the rifle held ready but not yet threatening. "That's far enough, Gary," he called out. Gary Baker reined in his horse about 30 feet from the cabin, his face flushed with excitement and righteous anger. "We know what you did, Kenneth," he shouted. "We know you married that woman to try to make your sinful arrangement respectable." "We're legally married," Kenneth replied calmly, "by a minister, with witnesses, with all the proper documentation. There's nothing sinful about it." "The hell there isn't," Gary snarled. "You think a piece of paper changes what you are? You think it wipes away months of living in sin?" Victoria felt anger flare in her chest at the man's self-righteous condemnation. She stepped onto the porch beside Kenneth, ignoring his warning look. "What we did before we were married is none of your business, Mr. Baker," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "And what we do now that we are married is certainly none of your concern." Gary Baker's face went red with rage. "You think you can just waltz into our community and corrupt it with your immoral behavior?" He spat. "You think decent people are going to stand for that?" "Decent people," Kenneth said with quiet emphasis, "mind their own business and let others live in peace." One of Gary's companions, a lean man with cruel eyes, spoke up for the first time. "We didn't come here to debate morality," he said. "We came to deliver a message." "What message?" Kenneth asked, though Victoria could see from his posture that he already suspected the answer. "You're not welcome in this territory anymore," the man continued. "Either of you. We want you gone by spring, or we'll make sure you leave permanently." The threat was unmistakable, and Victoria felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. These men were not just expressing moral disapproval, they were promising violence if their demands were not met. "This is my land," Kenneth said, his voice deadly quiet. "I have legal title to every acre of it. You have no authority to make demands or threats." Gary Baker laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Legal title doesn't mean much when decent folks decide you're not fit to live among them," he said. "Ask the Indians how much their legal treaties protected them." Victoria felt Kenneth tense beside her, and she knew they were approaching a point where words would give way to action. The three men facing them were armed and clearly prepared for violence, but Kenneth had the advantage of position and familiarity with the terrain. "I'm going to ask you one more time to leave my property," Kenneth said, raising the rifle slightly. The lean man's hand moved toward his gun, and Victoria held her breath, knowing that the next few seconds would determine whether this confrontation ended in words or bloodshed. But before anyone could draw a weapon, the sound of approaching horses echoed from the trail. All eyes turned toward the sound, and Victoria felt a surge of hope as she recognized the uniform of a territorial sheriff emerging from the trees. Sheriff Douglas Flores rode into the clearing with two deputies, his presence immediately changing the dynamic of the confrontation. He was a tall man with graying hair and the kind of steady authority that came from years of dealing with difficult situations. "What's going on here, gentlemen?" the sheriff asked, his tone deceptively casual but his eyes alert and watchful. Gary Baker's bluster faltered slightly in the face of legal authority. "Sheriff Flores," he said, "we were just having a discussion with Mr. Allen about community standards." Sheriff Flores looked around the scene, taking in the armed men, Kenneth's defensive posture, and the tension that crackled in the air like electricity. "This doesn't look like a discussion to me," he said mildly. "It looks like a confrontation." Kenneth lowered his rifle but kept it ready. "Sheriff," he said, "these men have been making threats against my wife and me. They've also set fire to the old trapper's cabin down the trail." Sheriff Flores's expression sharpened. "Is that true, Mr. Baker?" Gary Baker's face flushed again, but this time with embarrassment rather than anger. "We don't know anything about any fire," he said. The sheriff's gaze moved to the column of smoke still visible above the trees. "That fire didn't start itself," he said, "and I find it interesting that it happened to break out on the same day you decided to pay a visit to the Allens." He dismounted from his horse, his deputies following suit, and suddenly the three troublemakers found themselves outnumbered and facing official authority. "Mr. and Mrs. Allen," Sheriff Flores said, emphasizing Victoria's married name, "I understand you were wed recently. Congratulations." "Thank you, Sheriff," Victoria said, stepping forward slightly. "We're very happy." Sheriff Flores nodded, then turned back to Gary Baker and his companions. "Gentlemen, I think it's time for you to head back to town, and I don't want to hear about any more visits to this property unless you're invited." Gary Baker's face was purple with frustrated rage, but he was not stupid enough to defy a sheriff with two armed deputies. "We have rights," he said through gritted teeth. "Yes, you do," Sheriff Flores agreed. "But those rights don't include trespassing on private property, making threats, or committing arson. Now mount up and ride out before I decide to arrest you for disturbing the peace." The three men had no choice but to comply, though Gary Baker's parting glare promised that this was not over. They mounted their horses and rode away, leaving Victoria and Kenneth alone with the sheriff and his deputies. "I'm sorry you had to deal with that," Sheriff Flores said once the troublemakers were gone. "Gary Baker's been stirring up sentiment against you two in town, but most decent folks don't agree with his methods." "What about the fire?" Kenneth asked. "I'll investigate it," the sheriff promised. "And if I find evidence that it was deliberately set, there will be charges. In the meantime, you might want to be extra careful. Men like Baker don't give up easily when they think they have righteousness on their side." Victoria felt Kenneth's hand find hers, his fingers intertwining with her own in their familiar gesture of mutual support. "We'll be careful," she said. Sheriff Flores nodded approvingly. "You're good people," he said. "Don't let the narrow-minded few drive you away from the home you've built." After the sheriff and his deputies left, Victoria and Kenneth stood on their porch, looking out at the peaceful clearing that had been the scene of so much conflict. The column of smoke was beginning to dissipate, but the threat it represented lingered in the air between them. "They'll be back," Kenneth said quietly. "I know," Victoria replied, "but we'll be ready for them." Kenneth turned to look at her, and she saw pride and determination in his pale eyes. "Yes," he said, "we will." Spring came early that year, arriving in a rush of melting snow and budding trees that transformed the mountain landscape almost overnight. Victoria had never experienced the dramatic seasonal change that occurred at high altitude, and she found herself marveling at the way the world seemed to wake up all at once, as if nature itself was eager to shake off the constraints of winter. The early thaw also meant that the trail to town became passable sooner than expected, which brought both opportunities and concerns. Kenneth made several trips down the mountain to purchase supplies and check on the situation in Millfield, returning each time with reports that Gary Baker's campaign against them had largely failed to gain traction among reasonable people. "Most folks think Baker's gone too far," Kenneth reported after one such trip. The fire at the trapper's cabin was the last straw for a lot of people. Even those who might have been sympathetic to his moral arguments don't approve of arson and intimidation. Victoria felt a measure of relief at the news, but she also knew that desperate men were often the most dangerous. Gary Baker's failure to rally community support might make him more likely to take extreme action rather than less. Her concerns proved justified on a warm evening in late April, as she and Kenneth were finishing dinner and discussing plans for expanding the garden. They had grown comfortable with their evening routine, the quiet domesticity that had developed between them over the months of their marriage. And Victoria was beginning to think that perhaps the worst of their troubles were behind them. That illusion was shattered by the sound of breaking glass. Kenneth was on his feet instantly, moving toward the gun cabinet with the fluid grace of someone who had been expecting trouble. Victoria blew out the lamp, plunging the cabin into darkness, and moved away from the windows as Kenneth had taught her. Outside they could hear voices, at least 3 men by Victoria's count, moving around the perimeter of the cabin. One of them was definitely Gary Baker, his voice carrying clearly in the night air as he directed his companions to surround the building. "Kenneth," Gary called out, "we know you're in there. Time to face the consequences of your actions." Kenneth positioned himself at a window that gave him a clear view of the clearing, the rifle ready in his hands. "What do you want, Gary?" he called back. "We want justice," Gary replied. "We want you and that woman gone from this mountain, away from decent people who are trying to live moral lives." Victoria felt anger flare in her chest at being referred to as that woman, but she forced herself to remain calm and focused. This was not the time for emotional reactions. "We're not going anywhere," Kenneth said firmly. "This is our home, and we have every right to be here." "Rights," Gary laughed bitterly. "You think your rights matter more than the moral standards of an entire community." A second voice, one Victoria didn't recognize, spoke up from a different direction. "We gave you a chance to leave peacefully, Alan. You chose to ignore our warnings." Victoria realized with growing alarm that the men had indeed surrounded the cabin, positioning themselves to prevent escape. This was not another intimidation attempt. This was a coordinated assault. Kenneth seemed to reach the same conclusion. "Stay low," he whispered to Victoria, "and be ready to move when I tell you." The attack began with a flaming bottle thrown through one of the side windows, the glass shattering and the contents igniting immediately upon contact with the wooden floor. Victoria grabbed a bucket of water they kept near the fireplace and doused the flames before they could spread. but she knew this was only the beginning. More bottles followed, thrown from different directions, and Victoria found herself running from window to window, fighting fires while Kenneth tried to keep track of their attackers' positions. The cabin filled with smoke and the acrid smell of burning kerosene, making it difficult to breathe and impossible to see clearly. "Kenneth," Gary shouted from outside, "you can end this right now. Send the woman out, and we'll let you live." The offer was clearly a lie, designed to divide them and make them easier targets. But Victoria felt a moment of terrible temptation. If her presence was what had brought this violence to Kenneth's door, perhaps she should remove herself from the equation. "Don't even think about it," Kenneth said, as if he could read her thoughts. "We're in this together, Victoria. That's what marriage means." His fierce loyalty gave her strength, and she nodded grimly, redoubling her efforts to combat the fires that were beginning to take hold in several places around the cabin. The assault continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. A coordinated attack designed to drive them out into the open, where they could be more easily dealt with. But Kenneth had built his cabin well, with thick walls and a solid foundation, and their attackers' improvised weapons were not sufficient to destroy it quickly. It was Gary Baker's impatience that ultimately saved them. Frustrated by their failure to force Kenneth and Victoria out of the cabin, he decided to approach the front door directly, apparently believing that his moral authority would protect him from Kenneth's rifle. He was wrong. Kenneth's shot took Gary in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the ground with a scream of pain and outrage. The sound of the rifle shot echoed across the clearing like thunder, and for a moment, everything went silent. "Gary," one of his companions called out. "Gary, are you all right?" "I'm hit," Gary moaned. "The bastard shot me." Kenneth worked the rifle's action, chambering another round. "The next one won't be a warning shot," he called out. "Leave now, or face the consequences." There was a hurried conference among the remaining attackers, their voices too low to make out individual words, but their tone clearly indicating disagreement about how to proceed. Victoria held her breath, hoping that Gary's injury would be enough to convince them to retreat. Her hopes were dashed when one of the men, apparently the leader now that Gary was wounded, called out with renewed determination. "You just made this a lot worse for yourself, Alan. We came here to run you off. Now we're going to kill you both." The declaration sent a chill through Victoria's heart, but it also crystallized her resolve. These men had come to destroy everything she and Kenneth had built together, to tear apart the life they had chosen and the love they had found. She would not let that happen without a fight. "Kenneth," she whispered, moving to his side, "what do you need me to do?" Kenneth's expression was grim but determined. "There's another rifle in the bedroom closet," he said. "Can you use it?" Victoria thought about the shooting lessons Kenneth had given her over the winter months, the patient instruction in marksmanship and gun safety that had seemed like a practical skill rather than a necessity for survival. "Yes," she said, "I can use it." Kenneth nodded approvingly. "Cover the back of the cabin," he said. "Don't let them get behind us." Victoria retrieved the second rifle and positioned herself at a rear window, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. She could see movement in the trees, shadows that resolved into human figures as her eyes adjusted to the darkness. When the final assault came, it was swift and coordinated. Two men rushed the front of the cabin while a third attempted to break in through the back. Victoria found herself face to face with a stranger, a lean man with cruel eyes who had climbed through a broken window with a pistol in his hand. Time seemed to slow as Victoria raised the rifle and pulled the trigger. The recoil knocked her backward, and the man's pistol discharged harmlessly into the ceiling as he fell. Victoria stared at what she had done, shocked by her own capacity for violence, but not regretful of the choice she had made. At the front of the cabin, Kenneth was engaged in a desperate firefight with the remaining attackers. Victoria could hear the rapid exchange of gunfire, the splintering of wood as bullets struck the walls, the shouts and curses of men fighting for their lives. And then suddenly, it was over. The silence that followed the gunfire was profound and eerie, broken only by the crackling of small fires that still burned in various parts of the cabin and the distant sound of someone moaning in pain. "Kenneth," Victoria called out, her voice shaky with reaction. "I'm here," he replied. "Are you hurt?" "No." Victoria said. You. I'm fine, Kenneth said, though she could hear the exhaustion in his voice. They moved through the smoke-filled cabin, checking for remaining threats and assessing the damage. Gary Baker lay unconscious near the front door, his shoulder wound bleeding but not life-threatening. The man Victoria had shot was dead, and Kenneth's return fire had apparently driven off or killed the remaining attackers. We need to get word to the sheriff, Kenneth said, surveying the destruction around them. Victoria nodded, still in shock from the violence they had survived. The cabin was damaged but not destroyed, and more importantly, they were alive and together. Gary Baker's moral crusade had failed, defeated by their refusal to be intimidated and their willingness to defend what they had built. As dawn broke over the mountain, painting the snow-capped peaks in shades of gold and rose, Victoria stood on the damaged porch beside her husband and looked out over the clearing that had been the scene of so much conflict. The beauty of the morning seemed almost surreal after the violence of the night, but it also felt like a promise of renewal and hope. Kenneth's arm came around her waist, pulling her close against his side. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. Victoria leaned into his warmth, drawing strength from his steady presence. "I'm all right," she said. "We're all right." Kenneth pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Yes," he said, "we are." In the distance, Victoria could hear the sound of approaching horses, probably Sheriff Flores coming to investigate the reports of gunfire that had echoed across the mountain. There would be questions to answer, legal proceedings to navigate, repairs to make to their damaged home. But none of that mattered as much as the simple fact that they had survived, that they had faced the worst that hatred and intolerance could throw at them, and emerged victorious. Victoria had come to this mountain as a desperate widow with nowhere else to turn, and she had found not just shelter, but love, not just survival, but a new life built on solid foundations of mutual respect and shared purpose. The job that everyone else had refused, the position that had seemed like a last resort born of desperation, had turned out to be the best decision she had ever made. In Kenneth's arms, on this mountain that had become her sanctuary, Victoria had discovered that sometimes the most unlikely paths led to the most precious destinations. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, painting the world in brilliant light, Victoria smiled and held her husband close, knowing that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them together. And that, she realized, was all the security and happiness any person could reasonably ask for in this uncertain world. The mountain wind stirred the pines around their clearing, carrying with it the sense of spring and renewal, of growth and possibility. Victoria breathed deeply, filling her lungs with the clean air of her chosen home, and felt her heart swell with gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this moment, to this man, to this life that was entirely and completely her own.